For my research paper, I'm going to be studying the role of social media in revolutions. There are many aspects of this question that I can analyze. For example, how do protesters use social media? How does it help them? How does it hurt them? What are the techniques they use? What are the platforms they use? There's also the question of what factors influence the role of social media in a revolution. Each revolution is different and comes from a different culture, so they don't always use social media in the same way. Lastly, it's important to address the fact that being on social media puts you in danger of the government looking at how you're organizing your protests. So it's important to look at how in different revolutions they contended with this threat, the fact that the government has access to the internet too. To address this issue, I'm going to be looking at two case studies. The Hong Kong pro-democracy demonstrations of 2014 and 2019, and the Arab Spring of 2011. Despite the many differences in the movements, they come from different governments, different cultures, different parts of the world, social media played an important role in both. By analyzing each case, we can learn about the different ways social media can be used for demonstrations and what factors influence this. Hong Kong's current situation is a product of its unique history. When it was handed over from Britain to China, Hong Kongers expected that they would maintain democracy. The idea and the saying was, quote, "one country, two systems." Hong Kong would be part of China, one country, but would have its own system separate from China that would enable it to maintain its characteristic of a democratic, capitalist place that it had when Britain was ruling it. In reality, this really was not the case. Unsurprisingly, China has and continues, especially these days, to try to exert its influence and dominance on the city. And Hong Kongers stand up to this and are very mad because it's part of their characteristic. They don't feel Chinese. So one of the biggest examples of demonstrations was the Umbrella Movement of 2014, where demonstrators demanded democratic elections. They were mostly unsuccessful in that the government did not concede anything. However, in hindsight, this can be seen both as a failure and a stepping stone because they learned lessons from the 2014 demonstration, which they incorporated into the 2019 demonstrations. The 2019 demonstrations were when Hong Kongers took to the streets to protest an extradition bill that would subject them to Chinese judicial systems. These protests were more effective and the bill was pulled. However, they continued to protest because the protest had developed into being more than just against this one bill. We weren't really able to see the full extent of how this would affect the history of Hong Kong because of COVID. COVID slowed down these protests and it made it impossible to have these large-scale protests. So in both the 2014 and the 2019 demonstrations, social media played a very important role. Through social media, there was a fight of public opinion. Hong Kong demonstrators showed the police brutality that they were being subjected to try to influence the public to stand up against the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government. And the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, tried to sway public opinion by portraying demonstrators as really malicious and dangerous. They spread videos of protesters disrupting public transportation. They also sent videos of military tanks and equipment being ready to be mobilized to be used in Hong Kong. So as I said before, there are many lessons learned from the Umbrella Movement. So through social media, protesters organized, mobilized, and spread different messages. In the Umbrella Movement, it was mostly through Facebook. But they learned through this that Facebook is not the best platform and there's a need for anonymity and a truly leaderless movement. In 2019, the movement was somewhat different. They moved away from Facebook and towards encrypted platforms like Telegram and LIHKJ, which is what is called the Hong Kong equivalent of Reddit. These platforms helped encourage aspects of what made the 2019 demonstrations different, a focus on leaderlessness, unity, and a more radical separatist message. So all the way across the world, in the Middle East, there was the Arab Spring in 2011. It all started in Tunisia, where fruit vendors self-immolated in protest of corruption. This led to a national movement that ultimately resulted in the president stepping down in January of 2011. Shortly after, Egyptians were inspired by Tunisia and had an uprising of their own. There was a domino effect across the whole region where citizens from each country were uprising against their oppressive governments. However, there was the Arab Spring led to many different results. In places like Egypt and Tunisia, it led to relative peace and a more democratic system. However, in countries like Syria and Libya, it was a disaster and led to a complete, full-fledged civil war, and neither country is very stable today. Just like in Hong Kong, the Arab Spring had a strong social media component. Social media can be seen in the Arab Spring as both a method of a rallying cry, as through platforms like Facebook, Egyptian youth organized and mobilized, but it can also be seen as a beacon, a way in which Arabs in these uprisings showed the rest of the world what was happening to them and encouraged Arabs in other countries and just people generally to pay attention to what was going on. So many argue that social media was actually more of a beacon than it was a rallying cry. It wasn't really about mobilizing because they've referenced the fact that in Egypt, for example, 65% of people don't even have access to the internet. So it would be incorrect to think that the internet was responsible for mobilizing all these people. It really was word of mouth. This is not to say, though, that the internet didn't play an important part in the Egyptian revolution and Arab Spring revolutions. It's just that it might have played a different role in the Hong Kong revolutions. So personally, I do not have anything to do with this issue. I do believe, however, that we can learn from studying these two different revolutions. The Arab Spring and the Hong Kong revolutions show us modern revolutions and how social media affects them, and it's two very different situations. Hong Kong is a very wealthy, very developed, very modern, technologically advanced place, and they were protesting against China, with this giant government. Whereas in the Arab Spring, it told us about how the internet would affect uprisings in the developing world, and how it could actually be a very useful tool in mobilizing and spreading messages. I think there's lessons we can learn about all of the world from this, and also lessons we can apply to America. I remember during the Black Lives Matter, the big upsurge during, I think it was summer of 2020, there were a lot of videos circulating around the internet of how the Hong Kong protesters had these very advanced techniques of mobilizing and protesting, and so this just shows how the rest of the world is really being influenced by these two movements. So yeah, that's my paper.